They said I wasn't invited this time. Too much walking for you, Mom. That's how he put it, in that careful, softened voice people use when they're already halfway out the door. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He was tying his daughter's shoelace, eyes fixed on the knot like it might save him from seeing my face. I smiled, of course. I always smile when he says something that hurts. It's a habit formed over years of pretending the wound is just a misunderstanding. But that sentence lodged somewhere deep, right between my ribs, the way certain words do when you realize they've been practiced before being spoken aloud. I knew Lisa had rehearsed it with him, probably standing in their polished kitchen, probably saying something like, "She'll understand, she hates the heat," as if my discomfort were a gift to them. I am 78, not ancient, not helpless, not fading into wallpaper. But that's how they look at me now, like I'm an old photograph they can't bring themselves to throw away but don't want to frame either. The funny thing is, I had already packed a suitcase, not out of presumption, but out of hope. It was the small blue one Derek bought for our 30th anniversary trip to Charleston. I'd laid out light dresses, a sun hat, the sandals that still remember the feel of boardwalks. When I saw the brochure on their counter, Hawaii, all caps, bright hibiscus on the cover, I thought maybe they wanted to surprise me. A family trip, the kind you see in commercials where everyone laughs and no one grows old. I should have known better. Hope makes fools of the wise. I live alone now, in a small house that smells of lavender and old wood, the kind of place people describe as cozy when they really mean quiet. I keep it clean, I keep myself busy, gardening, reading, volunteering twice a week at the library. My world has shrunk, yes, but it's still mine. So when he said, almost cheerfully, that they'd be gone for 10 days, that I could rest, I wanted to ask what he thought I'd been doing all these years. Waiting? Resting? He meant it kindly, or that's what he would say if pressed. But kindness without curiosity is just control with better manners. He came over 2 days before the flight, carrying a new beach bag Lisa had ordered online. He set it on the table like a trophy, said, "The kids picked this for Grandma," and laughed. The tag was still on. A palm tree print, neon pink, far too young for me, and yet too ironic to be sincere. I thanked him anyway. He poured himself coffee, scrolled through his phone, mentioned how expensive the resort was, how Lisa needed a break. I nodded and asked who would feed the cat. He said, "We'll send the neighbor boy. You shouldn't worry about that." That's what they tell me often. Don't worry, don't fuss, don't plan, don't expect. It's their polite way of saying, don't exist in ways that interfere. When he left that afternoon, I stood by the window watching his car turn the corner. I could still see the faint outline of Derek's old toolbox in the garage, the one Adam once used to build a treehouse. He must have been 7 then, sticky with summer sweat, begging me to hold the board steady. "I'll make it strong enough for both of us," he'd said. And he did. We spent entire afternoons up there drinking lemonade, counting clouds, believing that love was something you built with your hands. I wonder if he remembers that. Probably not. Memory is a luxury the busy rarely afford. That night, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with the light off, because somehow the dark felt more honest. I kept hearing that sentence. "Too much walking for you, Mom," rolling it around in my head like a pebble you can't spit out. It wasn't the walking he meant, of course. It was the presence. My stories, my pace, my reminders of time. Families like theirs curate everything now, vacations, photos, even emotions. An aging mother doesn't fit the aesthetic. I used to think invisibility came gradually, but it doesn't. It happens in one clean line, one quiet decision you're not part of. Still, I tried to understand. I told myself maybe they just wanted time alone. Maybe the logistics were complicated. I folded the dresses back into the closet, replaced the suitcase on the top shelf. I even called Lisa the next morning to wish them a safe trip. Her voice was sugary, rushed, like someone stirring coffee too fast. "Oh, thank you, Martha. We'll send pictures," she said, and then quickly added, "You'll love having the house to yourself for a while." I almost laughed. My house to myself? What a novelty! After 40 years of solitude in a crowded world. When I hung up, I noticed my reflection in the window. The morning light caught every line, every soft fold of skin. And for the first time, I didn't see defeat there. I saw endurance, not the kind that begs to be admired, but the quiet endurance of things that have outlasted seasons. My hands are still steady. My legs still take me where I need to go, even if slower. The body changes, yes, but so does patience, and mine has reached its limit. On the day they left, I walked them to the car. The grandchildren were excited, the little one waving a plastic lei. "We'll bring you a seashell, Grandma," she shouted. Adam smiled like a man doing the right thing and said, "Take care of yourself, okay? Don't try to do too much." I said, "I'll try not to," and meant the opposite. The driveway smelled of wet asphalt. The sun was gentle. I stood there until the sound of the engine dissolved into distance. Then I went back inside, sat at the same table, and stared at the empty cup he'd left behind. A ring of coffee on the saucer, perfect and complete. People think betrayal comes with shouting or tears. It doesn't. It comes with absence. The sound of a door closing behind someone who has already left you in their mind. That afternoon, I watered the garden, folded laundry, fed the cat. Ordinary things, deliberate movements to fill the space they vacated. But under the rhythm of chores, a pulse was growing. Steady, new, defiant. I didn't name it yet, but I felt it. It was small at first, like the tremor before a storm, the kind that makes the curtains stir even when the windows are closed. By evening, the house was quiet in a way that used to scare me, but now felt like permission. I cooked for one, something simple, something mine. I ate slowly, tasting the food instead of swallowing memory. I turned on the radio, an old jazz station, the kind Derek loved. The trumpet filled the kitchen with a sound that didn't ask for company. And I realized, sitting there under the dim yellow light, that I could go anywhere I wanted, at any pace I chose, with no one to apologize to. Their trip wasn't a rejection. It was an opening. They'd built a wall of pity, and without meaning to, they left the gate unlocked. So yes, they're going to Hawaii, and I am staying home, at least for tonight. But the world is wide, and I have a passport that hasn't expired yet. They think they know what I'm capable of because they've stopped looking closely. They forget that women like me raised families from nothing, buried husbands without collapsing, held entire generations together with grocery lists and late-night prayers. If I can survive love, loss, and silence, surely I can survive a plane ride. When I washed the dinner plate, the water was hot enough to sting. I liked the feeling. It reminded me I still had nerves, still had blood that moves. I dried the dish, placed it carefully in the cabinet, and whispered to no one, "You wanted me to rest. Maybe I will, on a beach of my own choosing." Then I turned off the light, leaving the room bathed in the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. and for the first time in years, I didn't feel left behind. I felt like someone about to depart. When morning came, the air in the house felt heavier than usual, as if it too had learned to live with the weight of being overlooked. I woke early, the way I always do, long before the sun begins to argue with the blinds, and for a moment I forgot that they were gone. I expected to hear the familiar ping of my phone, some small courtesy from Adam. Landed safe. Mom, kids excited. Instead, there was only the steady hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the kitchen clock that Derek once claimed sounded like a heartbeat. I poured myself coffee, black and unadorned, and sat by the window watching a single leaf spin lazily in the wind. Somewhere over the Pacific, my family was being served juice in plastic cups. Lisa was probably telling a story about how stressful it had been to pack for everyone, and the children were asking if there would be dolphins. I tried to picture them thinking of me, even for a minute, but the image refused to come. They had planned this trip for months, every reservation, every dinner, every matching outfit, and not once had they imagined me beside them. That was the first betrayal. Not their leaving, but the quiet erasure that began long before. I had promised myself I wouldn't look, but habit has its own gravity. By noon, I found myself scrolling through their social feed. There they were, smiling in an airport lounge, sun hats on, Lisa holding the baby, Adam with his arm around her waist. The caption read, "Finally off to paradise." I studied each face carefully, waiting for the flicker of guilt that might suggest a second thought. None, just brightness, intention, a family perfectly composed. I told myself to stop. I told myself it didn't matter, but the heart, when insulted, becomes a scholar. It studies the wound until it understands its architecture. Around 3, the phone rang. I reached for it too quickly. The voice on the other end was Lisa's, light and untroubled. "Just checking in," she said, as if she were phoning a house sitter. "Everything okay there?" I said it was, that the cat was fine, that I hoped they were enjoying the trip. "Oh, it's beautiful," she said. "The kids are loving it. We're heading to a luau tonight. You'd laugh. It's so touristy." I made a sound that could pass for laughter. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "We'll bring you something from the market." I thanked her. We hung up. I set the phone on the table and looked at it like it was a small animal that had just bitten me. The next day stretched, long and shapeless. I tried reading, but the words wouldn't stay still. I vacuumed rooms that didn't need it. I dusted the mantel, though no one but me would notice. By late afternoon, I was standing in the hallway, staring at the framed photographs I'd kept over the years. Adam's graduation, our last Christmas with Derek, the grandkids when they were small enough to believe I could fix anything. I thought about taking one down, maybe the photo of Adam in his college cap, but I didn't. I wasn't ready for vengeance. I was still learning the shape of disappointment. It isn't sharp. It's slow and dissolving, like sugar melting into tea. That evening, I went to the grocery store just to be among people. The aisles glowed under the steady white of fluorescent light. I moved slowly, touching things I didn't need. Bags of rice, jars of honey, a loaf of bread I would never finish alone. Near the checkout, a young woman was arguing softly with her little boy. He wanted a toy car. She was counting coins. The sight of her bent over the register stirred something I hadn't felt in years, the old pulse of caretaking, the automatic urge to reach out, to give. But I stopped myself. Not out of stinginess, but out of understanding. We all have to learn where generosity ends and self-erasure begins. Outside, twilight had come softly, the sky the color of bruised fruit. I loaded my groceries, sat in the driver's seat, and for the first time said the words aloud. They didn't want me there. Saying it didn't bring pain, it brought clarity, the kind that tastes metallic. I started the engine, but instead of turning toward home, I drove toward the airport. I told myself it was only to watch the planes, the way Derek and I used to when we couldn't afford tickets. The parking lot was almost empty. I sat facing the runways, headlights off, and watched a plane rise into the fading light, its belly catching fire from the sun. I imagined them up there, my family, comfortable, laughing, unaware that below them their absence was being measured in steady breaths. I watched until the plane was a dot, then nothing. Inside the terminal, the air smelled of coffee and jet fuel, a scent that always feels like possibility. People were rushing past me with the purposeful energy of those who know where they're going. I walked among them slowly, my old leather purse pressed to my side. Every voice, every announcement felt like a reminder that movement is the opposite of invisibility. At the end of the concourse, there was a small travel desk, one of those old-fashioned counters with brochures still fanned neatly in plastic holders. I stopped without planning to, drawn by the photographs. Mountains, lakes, cities. A young woman behind the desk looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her tone was polite, unguarded, not pitying. For a moment, I didn't answer. Then I heard myself say, "Yes, I'd like to see what flights are available this week." She smiled, tapped on her keyboard, and asked where I wanted to go. The question lingered like an open door. I could have said anywhere. Boston, Portland, even Paris, if I'd been feeling theatrical. But what came out was a whisper. Hawaii. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Popular choice. For one? I nodded. For one? She started reading out options, dates, prices. I listened, nodding, feeling the heat rising in my cheeks. When she mentioned Maui, I said yes, though I didn't rationalize. It felt like answering a call that had been ringing for years. When she asked for my ID, my hands didn't shake. I took out the card, slid it across, watched her type my name. She asked if I wanted a return date. "Not yet," I said. She smiled as though she understood. "One way, then." Her fingers moved quickly, printing the ticket, placing it in a small envelope. "You'll love it there," she said. "Traveling alone?" I nodded again, and she added quietly, "Best way to travel sometimes." I wanted to tell her she was right, that sometimes the only way to find home again is to leave everyone who thinks they own it. But I only said, "Thank you." Back in the car, I opened the envelope and looked at the ticket. My name, the destination, the date. 3 small lines that rearranged an entire life. The cost was more than I'd planned to spend on anything, but the money was mine, the savings Derek left untouched until now. I thought of Adam talking about our family finances, as if I'd been absorbed into his budget. The thought made me laugh softly. Autonomy is expensive, but dependence costs more. At home, I placed the ticket under the lamp, its corners catching the light. I packed slowly, carefully, as if preparing an altar. Clothes that could breathe, the sun hat after all, the sandals that had been waiting. I hesitated over the photograph of Derek on our honeymoon, the one where he's squinting against the sun, smiling at me like I'm the only thing worth seeing. I slipped it into a book and then into my bag. On the kitchen table, I left a note, not for Adam, not for anyone else, just for the house. Gone traveling. Don't wait up. That night, I barely slept. The air hummed with a new kind of energy, nervous but alive. At dawn, I made coffee and stood by the window watching the first slice of light cut across the lawn. The cat brushed against my leg, confused by the suitcase near the door. I told her she'd be fine, that I'd left enough food, that sometimes even the caretakers need to disappear for a while. I locked the door, slid the key under the mat, and walked to the cab, waiting at the curb. The driver was an older man, silver-haired, quiet. He asked if I was visiting family. "No," I said. "I'm visiting myself." He didn't comment, just nodded and turned up the radio. Soft, classical music filling the car. The road stretched ahead, ordinary and infinite. At the terminal, the same one where I'd once stood waving goodbye to them, I wheeled my suitcase inside. For a moment I paused, looking at the departures board. So many names of places, so many exits. And then, without ceremony, I joined the line. There is a moment right before the plane lifts from the ground when everything in you wants to cling to the familiar. I felt it. The tremor of fear, the voice whispering, too late, too old, too foolish. But above that voice, another spoke, clearer, older, fiercer. You've been left behind once already. Don't let it happen again. The engines roared, the ground fell away, and the city grew small beneath me. I didn't look back. I closed my eyes and breathed. That was the moment, not when they left me, but when I chose to leave them, that the story truly began. The first night in Maui arrived soft and heavy with salt. The air was thicker than I expected, sweet in the throat, like breathing through honey. When I stepped out of the airport, the lights shimmered in a haze that made everything look slightly forgiving. I had booked a small hotel near the beach, nothing fancy, the kind of place that still uses metal keys instead of cards. The woman at the desk wore a flower behind her ear and greeted me as if I were expected. That startled me more than it should have. I'd grown used to being extra, an afterthought, a seat added at the corner of the table. But she said my name with warmth, wrote it neatly in the logbook, handed me the key, and said, "You're on the second floor, Oceanside." The phrase Oceanside settled into me like a promise. I thanked her, carried my bag upstairs slowly, and when I opened the door, I found a small room with one bed, a fan, a single chair, and a window facing the restless dark. The sound of the waves came immediately, low and steady, like someone breathing beside you in the dark. I didn't unpack right away. I sat on the bed, shoes still on, and just listened. For years I'd lived inside silence, but this was different. This was noise that didn't require response. I slept lightly, my body unsure of its new geography, and woke before sunrise. The horizon was a narrow band of fire. I made tea with the little kettle by the sink and stood at the window watching the light pull itself over the water. The beach below was empty except for a man walking his dog. It was strange, the way solitude here felt full instead of hollow. In Wilmington, being alone had always sounded like an absence, a door closing somewhere down the hall. Here it was an opening, a space that breathed with me. After breakfast, I walked down to the sand. The tide had left a scatter of shells, and each one looked like a decision. Some cracked, some whole, all beautiful for reasons beyond repair. I picked one up, held it against my palm, and thought about the way I'd been treated like something fragile all these years. People mistake fragility for weakness, but they're not the same. Fragile things survive precisely because they know how to bend. At a cafe by the water, I ordered coffee and papaya toast. The waiter, a young man with a faded tattoo of a bird on his wrist, asked if I wanted to sit inside or outside. Outside, I said. I didn't come all this way to look through glass. He laughed, a bright sound, unguarded. It felt strange to make someone laugh and not feel self-conscious afterward. For years, every word I'd spoken in my son's house had felt like a test. Too quiet, and I was irrelevant. Too loud, and I was difficult. Here, I could speak, and no one measured me against what I used to be. I ate slowly, watching the people passing, couples with maps, children dripping with sunscreen, locals hauling coolers. Everyone moving somewhere. I realized I'd been still for decades, orbiting other people's plans. Later, I walked through a small market behind the hotel. The air smelled of mango, incense, and fried dough. Stalls overflowed with scarves, wooden bracelets, postcards, and hand-painted signs about living simply. A woman selling jewelry called out, "You have wise eyes, Auntie." I laughed and told her that wisdom is just what's left when illusions are gone. She nodded, like she understood exactly what I meant. I bought a silver pendant shaped like a wave, more for the gesture than for the thing itself. She tied it around my neck and said, "Now you belong to the sea." I wasn't sure if I believed her, but I liked the idea of belonging to something that didn't expect explanations. In the afternoons, the sky changed mood quickly. One moment blue, the next, veiled with rain that came and went without apology. I walked anyway, umbrella in hand, the streets slick under my sandals. I passed honeymooners posing for photos, and for a second, I almost felt embarrassed to be there alone. Then I realized that none of them were looking at me. They were all too busy curating their happiness. That's when I understood that invisibility can be freedom if you choose it. Each day, I explored a little further, following paths that led nowhere in particular. I visited a small library tucked between two shops. It smelled of dust and paper, the same as the one where I used to volunteer. The librarian, a woman near my age, asked if I was staying long. "A week," I said, though I wasn't sure. She smiled knowingly and said, "People say that and end up staying forever." I borrowed a used copy of The Old Man and the Sea and spent the evening reading it by the window, the words mingling with the sound of the surf. Hemingway wrote about endurance the way I've lived it, quietly, without witnesses. By the third day, I found a rhythm that belonged to no one but me. Wake early, walk, eat, read, swim when the tide was kind. The ocean surprised me. It wasn't gentle. The first time I went in, a wave knocked me down, salt rushing up my nose, sand burning my knees. I came out coughing, laughing, and strangely exhilarated. The lifeguard whistled and asked if I was all right. "Perfect," I said, and meant it. There was a purity in being humbled by something vast and indifferent. It reminded me that control was an illusion, that surrender could be a kind of power. In the evenings, I sat on the beach, watching the sky unravel into color. The families gathered with picnics and Bluetooth speakers, the children shrieking in the shallows. I didn't envy them. I simply watched. I thought about Adam and Lisa, about how certain they were that I couldn't keep up. Maybe they were right in one way. I couldn't keep up with their idea of living, the endless running toward the next perfect picture. But I could walk, and walking was enough. One night, I wrote a postcard to myself. "You are not missing out." You are arriving. I didn't send it, just kept it tucked in my book as proof. On the fourth day, I took a bus inland to a botanical garden. The road wound through hills lush with green so intense it almost hurt the eyes. At the garden, a guide named Rosa offered a tour. She was maybe 60, small and strong, with skin the color of caramel and a voice that carried stories in every syllable. We walked together among orchids and ferns, and she told me about her late husband, about raising 3 sons who now lived on the mainland and rarely called. I told her mine had gone to Hawaii without me, and she laughed softly, not unkindly. Maybe they needed distance to see you clearly, she said. I told her I doubted it. She shrugged. Then maybe you needed distance to see yourself. That line stayed with me long after she waved goodbye. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay listening to the ocean's restlessness and thought about all the small ways I had disappeared over the years, letting others decide when I was needed, how I should dress, where I should sit. I realized invisibility doesn't happen once. It happens by 1,000 small permissions. I had signed each one, politely, thinking it was love. Now I was rewriting the contract, line by line. By the end of the week, the hotel clerk greeted me by name. The cafe waiter started bringing me my order without asking, and Rosa invited me to her cousin's small restaurant for dinner. I almost said no, afraid of intruding, but she insisted. The restaurant was little more than a patio strung with lights, the smell of garlic and lime thick in the air. People talked loudly, laughed easily, and no one seemed to care who I was or why I was alone. Rosa introduced me as my friend from the mainland, and for the first time in years, the word friend felt accurate. We ate grilled fish and rice, drank cold beer from the bottle, and when someone started playing a guitar, a few couples danced barefoot on the concrete. Rosa pulled me up, and though I protested that I didn't dance, she said, "Then sway. It's enough." So I did. The rhythm was slow, the air warm against my skin, and I thought, if Adam could see me now, he wouldn't recognize me. Maybe that was the point. Walking back to the hotel that night, the street quiet, I felt something unfamiliar, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with place or people. It came from the simple fact of movement, of choosing, of being the author of my own evening. The realization startled me with its gentleness. I had spent so many years waiting for permission to live that I'd forgotten the world doesn't issue permits. You either go or you don't. When I reached the hotel, a message light was blinking on my phone. My heart stuttered. For a second, I imagined it was Adam, maybe realizing what he'd done, maybe saying he was sorry. I pressed play. It was the airline, confirming my return flight. I deleted it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I opened the window wide, let the night air fill the room, and whispered to no one, "I'm not finished here." The next morning, I walked farther than before, up a hill overlooking the town. My knees ached, but it was a good ache, earned and alive. From the top, I could see the curve of the bay, the roofs shining like scales in the sunlight. The sea stretched out endless and indifferent, and I understood that this place owed me nothing. That was its gift. I sat on a bench, pulled the shell from my pocket, and turned it over in my hand. A small crack ran along its edge, but it caught the light beautifully. I thought, maybe that's what survival really is, carrying the cracks that prove you lived. When I walked back down, I passed a family taking photos by the lookout. The mother smiled at me and asked if I could take their picture. I did, framing them against the sky, And when I handed back the phone, she said, "Would you like one too?" I hesitated, then handed her my phone. I stood alone, smiling into the wind, and let her click the shutter. Later, looking at the photo, I saw it wasn't flattering. My hair wild, my dress wrinkled, but my eyes were alive. I kept that picture. It was the first in years that looked like me. By evening, I had decided to extend my stay. When I told the woman at the front desk, she smiled knowingly. "Maui does that," she said. "It makes you forget what you were escaping." I corrected her gently. "I didn't forget. I just stopped running from it." She nodded, slid a new key card across the counter, and said, "Welcome home, Ms. Harlow." I took it, surprised by the warmth in my chest. Home was not a place, I realized. It was a decision, and I had just made one. The fourth morning began with a sharp breeze that rattled the curtains and carried the smell of wet earth from a night of sudden rain. I woke before dawn, not because of habit, but because I wanted to watch the sky shift again, the pale gray yielding to amber. The ocean below my window seemed calmer that day, as if it too had taken a breath after all its restless roaring. I brewed coffee, the bitter kind from the little packet by the sink, and stood barefoot on the balcony, my hair uncombed, my heart steady in a way it hadn't been in years. The air held a whisper of chill, and I felt it as a reminder that even paradise has weather. I was beginning to understand that peace wasn't the absence of pain, but the acceptance that it belongs to the same landscape. When the first rays touched the water, I knew I would not be leaving soon. I had no reason to rush home, no one waiting to ask about my flight. The thought no longer hurt. It liberated. After breakfast, I walked down the narrow road that curved behind the hotel and led toward the residential part of the island. The tourist noise faded into the background, replaced by the rhythm of ordinary life. Barking dogs, clattering dishes, a radio playing some old country tune through an open window. I liked that sound, the humble persistence of people living unphotographed days. I stopped at a corner store painted green and yellow, bought a bottle of water, and asked the cashier if she knew of any cafes that hired part-time help. She looked at me for a second, surprised, maybe wondering why an old visitor was asking about work. I told her I just liked staying busy. She smiled and said her cousin's place down by the harbor might need someone. I thanked her, folded the name she'd scribbled on a receipt, and slipped it into my pocket. It wasn't that I needed money. Derek's pension still trickled in, steady if small, and I had savings that could last me. It was something else, a hunger to belong somewhere, not because of obligation, but because of usefulness. When you stop being needed, the body begins to fade. I'd felt that dimming for years in Adam's house, the polite dismissal disguised as care, the way they'd always say, "You've done enough, Mom," when what they meant was, "We've decided you're finished." But I wasn't finished. I was still full of hands that knew how to work, how to comfort, how to mend. By noon, I found the cafe. It was a small, weather-beaten place with a chalkboard sign that read, "Coffee first, questions later." I liked it immediately. Inside, the walls were painted turquoise, the tables mismatched, and the air smelled of cinnamon and roasted beans. A woman in her 50s with sun-bleached hair and an apron was wiping down the counter. She looked up, squinting slightly. "You here for coffee or company?" she asked. I said, "Maybe both if you're offering." She laughed and said her name was Heather. When I mentioned the cashier's cousin, she tilted her head, studying me. "You ever worked in a cafe before?" I told her no, but I'd spent 40 years running a family, cooking 3 meals a day, hosting PTA bake sales, and keeping everyone alive. That counts, she said. You're hired for a trial shift tomorrow. 6 to 11, don't be late. I walked out with a strange flutter in my chest, something between fear and joy. Work meant purpose. Purpose meant direction. That evening, I ironed my blouse, the one that still held its shape, and laid it on the chair. I thought of Adam then. How proud he'd been when he got his first job selling insurance. How he'd come home talking about clients and commissions while I cooked dinner. How I'd told him, the first paycheck feels like proof. Now, decades later, I would have my own proof again, not for survival, but for self. The next morning, I arrived early. The street was still waking, the air cool and sharp. Heather was already there, setting up chairs. She handed me an apron and said, "No perfume. Keep your hair back. Refill cups before they're empty." I nodded, grateful for her directness. The first customers were construction workers, their laughter heavy with exhaustion. I moved carefully, balancing plates and mugs, memorizing orders, listening. There was music playing from a small speaker, something bluesy, slow but alive. As the hours passed, my hands remembered the rhythm of service, the way tasks become prayer when done with care. I didn't think about age or pride or what Adam might say. I only thought about the next cup of coffee, the next name to remember, the next smile to return. When the morning rush ended, Heather poured herself a drink, slid one toward me, and said, "You made it. Most people quit by now." I laughed, a real laugh that shook something loose in me. "I've lived through worse mornings," I said. She nodded. "Then you're hired." After work, I walked back to the hotel with my feet sore, but my spirit strangely light. The paycheck was small, barely enough to matter, but it mattered to me. I tucked the crumpled bills into my wallet like a secret. I hadn't earned money in so long that I'd forgotten how sacred it feels to hold the result of your own effort, unshared, unborrowed, untouched by guilt. I stopped at a second-hand shop on the way. In the window hung a navy blue coat with deep pockets and a missing button. I tried it on, and it fit like memory, comfortable, dignified, solid. The owner gave me a small discount when I paid in cash. "Looks like it's been waiting for you," she said. I walked out wearing it, despite the heat, because sometimes warmth is not about temperature, but about reclaiming skin. That evening, I took the bus to Rosa's neighborhood. She'd invited me to dinner with her friends, older women who met every week to cook and gossip. Her house smelled of onions and sea air. The kitchen was crowded with laughter, voices overlapping, hands stirring, slicing, passing plates. They welcomed me as if I'd been missing, not new. There was something maternal and fierce about them, a sisterhood built on shared exhaustion and humor. One of them, a tall woman named Lani, asked how long I was staying. I said I didn't know. She nodded approvingly. "The best answers are the ones with no deadlines," she said. Later, as we ate, someone asked if I had family. I hesitated, then told them a shorter version of the truth. They didn't gasp or pity. Rosa simply reached across the table and said, "Then tonight, you have us." When I returned to the hotel that night, the moon was high and bright, the ocean restless again. I opened the window and let the wind whip through the curtains. The coat hung on the chair, the paycheck tucked safely in its pocket. I sat on the bed, my hands still smelling faintly of coffee and garlic, and thought about the odd satisfaction that had taken root inside me. It wasn't happiness exactly, not yet, but it was something sturdier, an inner quiet, the kind you earn when you've finally stopped asking to be seen. I understood then that the midpoint of a life is not marked by years, but by the moment you choose yourself over the versions others wrote for you. The next morning at the cafe, a regular came in, a man in his early 80s, neatly dressed, carrying a folded newspaper. He ordered black coffee, 2 sugars, and sat by the window. When I brought his cup, he smiled. "You pour like you've done this all your life," he said. I told him it just took practice. He came back the next day and the day after that. His name was Arthur, a widower from Seattle spending the winter here. We talked about small things at first. The weather, the stubbornness of birds, the best brand of jam. But gradually, our conversations stretched into the kind that fills spaces without effort. I liked his quietness, the way he listened without rehearsing replies. Once he said, "Funny, isn't it, how people forget the world still has room for us?" I nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. As the days unfolded, my routines deepened into something like a new life. Work in the morning, walks in the afternoon, dinner sometimes alone, sometimes with Rosa's circle. I started recognizing faces on the street, and they recognized mine. A wave here, a smile there. The island no longer felt like a place I'd fled to. It felt like a mirror reflecting back a woman I'd almost lost. One afternoon, while closing up the cafe, Heather said, "You're different from when you started." Lighter. I told her I'd been carrying too many invisible suitcases. She nodded. "We all do, till we unpack." Back in my room, I looked at the old photo of Adam I kept folded in my wallet. He was 12, freckled, grinning with a missing tooth. I touched the edge of the picture and felt no anger, just a strange tenderness. He was still that boy somewhere beneath all his grown-up fear. I didn't need his apology anymore. I only needed to stop waiting for it. I turned the photo over and wrote on the back, "He left me behind." I moved ahead. Then I placed it in the drawer with the postcard to myself. That night, I stood again by the ocean, the sand cool beneath my feet. The waves came and went, endless, forgiving. I thought about the woman who'd left Wilmington certain she'd been discarded. She hadn't been. She'd been released. The difference is everything. I whispered a quiet thank you to the island, to the salt, to the hurt that pushed me here. Sometimes the midpoint isn't where you arrive. It's where you finally stop running from the beginning. It happened one Sunday afternoon, the kind of afternoon when everything looks soft and harmless, when even the sky seems to be dozing. The cafe had closed early because of a street festival, and I was walking home through the crowd, moving slowly so I could watch the music and the dancing. The air shimmered with laughter, frying oil, and something floral from the leis people were wearing. It felt almost indecent to be that alive. I had learned to love my invisibility here. It was a kind of armor that allowed me to move without being measured. But that day, invisibility betrayed me, because it was in that anonymity that I saw them. I didn't recognize them at first. I saw the little girl first, running toward a stall of coconuts, her braid swinging. It was only when she turned, when I saw her face, my granddaughter's face, that I froze. And behind her, holding a shopping bag, wearing the same smug efficiency as always, was Lisa. And then Adam, a few steps behind, holding his phone up for another picture. For a moment, the whole world tilted. They were supposed to be on another island, miles away, somewhere safe from my existence. But there they were, laughing, tanned, a perfect family tableau. I could have turned away, melted back into the crowd, preserved the small paradise I'd built for myself. I almost did. But then Adam saw me. His face changed in stages. Surprise, disbelief, something that might have been shame, and then, finally, irritation. He said my name once, sharply, like a teacher catching a child out of place. I stood still, my grocery bag in hand, my apron folded under my arm. For a second, no one moved. The festival sounds swelled around us, music and drums and the murmur of strangers, as if the island itself refused to notice our private earthquake. Then Lisa recovered first, her smile automatic, brittle. "Martha, what a coincidence," she said, as if coincidence were a polite word for intrusion. I looked at her, then at my son. "Hello?" I said. "I didn't expect to see you here." Adam's jaw tightened. "We didn't expect to see you either." The words were clean, precise, cutting. I could feel the stares of passers-by, curious, then gone. I wanted to ask him why he was angry, because I had dared to exist beyond his plans, because I had refused to be the quiet ghost he left behind. But I didn't speak. He asked where I was staying, his voice low, almost whispering, as if my being there were indecent. "Here," I said simply. "On this island. I work at a cafe by the harbor." He blinked, as if I'd said something absurd. "Work?" he repeated. "You're working? Mom, what are you doing?" I wanted to laugh. "I'm living," I said. "You should try it sometime." Lisa touched his arm, whispering something, probably to calm him. He exhaled sharply and said, "We'll talk later." It wasn't an invitation, it was a command dressed as concern. Then they walked away, the children skipping ahead, the picture of normality restored. That night, I sat by the window of my room, the air too thick to breathe. I felt both old and weightless, like smoke. I had imagined, foolishly, that I could reinvent myself in peace, that the world would leave me be once I chose myself. But family has a way of finding you, especially when you've stopped needing it. I knew the conversation would come, that he wouldn't let it rest. And he didn't. 2 days later, he appeared at the cafe. It was early afternoon, quiet, only a few tables occupied. I was behind the counter wiping cups when I looked up and saw him standing at the door. No one had to tell me who he was. I could feel the shift in air, the familiar tension of being observed through disappointment. He came inside slowly, looking around as if my presence here were a crime scene he needed to inspect. Heather, bless her, sensed the tension immediately and gave me a small nod before retreating to the back. He sat down at a corner table. "Can we talk?" he said. I dried my hands and joined him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The light through the window made a pattern on his face, and I saw the boy he used to be, the one who built tree houses and promised never to leave me behind. That memory only sharpened the pain of the man sitting before me now. "You're angry," I said. He shook his head. "I'm confused," he replied. "You didn't tell me you were coming here." I almost smiled. "I wasn't aware I needed permission." His mouth tightened. "That's not what I mean. I just don't understand why you'd do something so impulsive. You could have gotten hurt, or lost, or embarrassed you," I interrupted. The words landed between us like a stone. He didn't deny it. "I just wish you'd told me," he said finally. we would have maybe found a way to include you. The lie was so gentle it almost sounded kind. I leaned back and looked at him, really looked, and saw a man exhausted by control, desperate to curate every version of his life. You didn't want to include me, I said quietly. You wanted to exclude me nicely, and now that I've refused, it bothers you. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. Mom, please, don't make this dramatic. I laughed then, softly. But it wasn't humor. It was clarity. You took my place in your life and turned it into a ghost story. The only thing dramatic is your surprise that the ghost learned to walk. He looked away, embarrassed, angry, uncertain which. He asked when I planned to return home. I don't know, I said. I like it here. I have friends. I work. I breathe. His eyes softened for a second, maybe realizing something he hadn't allowed himself to before. You sound different, he said. I am, I replied. Different doesn't mean broken? For a long time, he didn't speak. Then, quietly, the kids miss you. I nodded. They'll remember me better this way. He frowned. What's that supposed to mean? It means, I said, that they'll remember a grandmother who still had her own story, not someone sitting by the window, waiting for phone calls. He stood then, uncertain, restless. I'll tell Lisa you're okay, he said. I nodded. Tell her whatever version of okay makes her comfortable. He hesitated, then leaned down and kissed my forehead. The gesture was so familiar, so automatic, that it felt hollow. Then he left. The door swung closed, the bell above it chiming once, bright and cruel. That evening, I walked to the beach. The sky was bruised purple, the waves rougher than usual, the wind full of salt. I kicked off my shoes and walked until the water reached my calves. The current tugged at me, insistent, almost playful. I thought of the years I'd spent yielding to other tides, my husband's moods, my son's expectations, society's quiet verdict on women who age past usefulness. I felt the sea push and pull and realized I didn't need to resist or surrender. I could simply stand. I stayed there until the horizon disappeared. The next morning, the cafe was busier than usual. Word had spread about the festival, and tourists crowded in for coffee. I moved quickly, automatically, smiling, greeting, clearing. But inside, something had shifted again. The encounter with Adam had stirred a sediment I thought had settled. I found myself questioning everything, whether I'd truly escaped or if I'd only created a prettier cage. At closing time, Heather noticed my distraction. You all right, hun? She asked. I said I was fine. She studied me for a moment, then said, Don't let anyone make you small again. You've got a big light. I can see it. I thanked her, not trusting my voice. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Adam's face, the confusion, the defensiveness. There was a time when that would have undone me, but now it only clarified the distance between us, the necessary space where love could finally breathe without suffocation. Around midnight, there was a knock on my door. I froze, heart pounding. When I opened it, Rosa stood there, her hair wrapped in a scarf, holding 2 cups of tea. I saw your boy in town, she said. He looked lost. I nodded. He's fine, I said. He just found out his mother doesn't belong to him. She smiled faintly, handing me a cup. That's a hard thing for sons to learn. We sat together on the balcony, the night thick around us. Rosa told me about her own sons, how each of them had pulled away in different ways, how she'd learned to stop chasing their attention. They come back eventually, she said, but not as children. They come back as strangers you have to meet all over again. I asked if she resented them. She shook her head. No, I just stopped giving them the power to define my joy. Her words sank deep. After she left, I stayed up watching the waves catch the moonlight, silver and ungraspable. The following week, Adam came again. This time he wasn't angry. He seemed smaller, deflated. He asked if we could take a walk. We did, along the pier. The wind tangled my hair, and seagulls cried above us. Lisa thinks you're punishing us, he said, by being here. I almost laughed. Do I look punished? He smiled weakly. No. You look free. Maybe that's what bothers us. We stopped by the railing, looking out over the water. He took a deep breath. I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know when I started thinking of you as fragile. Maybe after Dad died. Maybe before. I just wanted to protect you. I nodded slowly. Protect me from what? From the living? He shook his head. From being hurt again. I touched his arm lightly. Hurt isn't the enemy, Adam. A life without hurt isn't living. It's waiting for permission. He looked at me then, truly looked. And for a moment the space between us was quiet and full. When he left that afternoon, I didn't cry. I didn't feel vindicated either. What I felt was release. The kind that comes when the roles you've worn your whole life finally slide off your shoulders and fall into the sea. That evening, I walked to the harbor where boats rocked gently in the fading light. The air was heavy with salt and diesel. I watched a fisherman untangle his nets, patient, methodical, as if every knot were a prayer. I realized I had my own nets to untangle, threads of guilt and habit that had bound me to a version of myself that no longer existed. That night, I took the photograph of Derek from my bag and held it against my heart. You'd laugh, I whispered. I came here to disappear, and instead I found myself staring back. I could almost hear his chuckle, the one that always came before he said, You were never meant to fade, Martha. I placed the photo on the windowsill beside the shell I'd found my first morning here. The moonlight hit both, making them gleam softly, reminders of love and endurance. The two currencies that never lose their value. The next day, Rosa and I went swimming early, before the tourists arrived. The water was cold and clear, the sky endless. When I dove in, the shock took my breath away, but beneath the surface everything was calm, soundless. For a few seconds, suspended in that weightless blue, I felt like everything that had ever been heavy had been washed clean. I came up gasping, laughing, alive. Rosa splashed me playfully, shouting something in Hawaiian. I didn't understand but understood anyway. When we came ashore, I wrapped myself in a towel and watched the waves reclaim our footprints. Nothing stays. That's the beauty of it. Later, as I walked back to my room, I passed a small shop selling postcards. One caught my eye, an old woman standing on a cliff, her back to the camera, the sea before her. The caption read, She finally went where she wasn't invited. I bought it, tucked it into my journal, and smiled. Some coincidences are too perfect to question. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, I felt something settle inside me. Not peace, not closure, but equilibrium. My son would go home, return to his life, maybe still confused by the mother he couldn't categorize. That was fine. I didn't need to be understood anymore. The island had taught me a language beyond explanation, the quiet grammar of presence, the syntax of salt and sunlight. I wasn't waiting for anything, not forgiveness, not reconciliation. I had already arrived. When night came, I walked once more to the edge of the shore. The tide was low, the sand cool. I bent down, picked up a small, smooth stone, and held it tightly. It wasn't a token or a symbol. It was simply there, like me. I threw it into the sea and watched the ripples spread, one circle after another, until they disappeared. That was the shape of my life now, ever widening, vanishing, beginning again. The letter arrived 3 weeks after Adam had gone home. It came tucked among bills and tourist brochures, slid under my door by the hotel clerk, who smiled and said, "From the mainland, Miss Harlow." I thanked her, though my hands trembled as I took it. The envelope was white and thick, the handwriting neat but uncertain. Adams. For a long while I just stared at it, tracing the familiar slope of each letter. I brewed tea and sat at the small table by the window, the one overlooking the street where bougainvillea climbed the walls like flames. The island moved gently outside. Voices, a passing moped, the scent of rain evaporating from warm stone. Finally, I opened the envelope. His words were careful, almost formal, as if he were afraid they might bruise if he pressed too hard. He wrote that they were home, that the children had told stories about running into Grandma in Hawaii, that Lisa had been embarrassed by how things unfolded, that he himself hadn't slept well since our talk on the pier. He said he wanted to understand me but didn't know how. He ended with a line that read, "If you ever decide to come home, we'll make room for you here." I read it 3 times, then placed it on the table beside my empty cup. "Make room for you here." The words felt like a gift wrapped in apology and sealed with pity. I wasn't angry. I was simply done being a guest in places I had built. The island had taught me that belonging isn't granted. It's claimed. I folded the letter neatly, slipped it into my journal, and went for a walk. The day was bright, but clouds were gathering over the ocean, dark and dense, like an argument waiting for its moment. I walked toward the harbor, where the water slapped against the wooden docks and gulls screamed like gossiping old women. Rosa was there, sitting on a bench, her straw hat pulled low. She looked up and waved. I sat beside her and without a word handed her the letter. She read it silently, her face unreadable, then folded it again and said, "So he's still trying to own your peace." We sat in silence, the wind rising around us. "What are you going to do?" she asked finally. I looked at the horizon, at the dark water swelling against itself. "I think I'll go see the volcano," I said. She laughed. "Of course you will." It wasn't a metaphor when I said it, but later I understood that it became one. There are places where the earth remembers its anger, where it refuses to cool, and people travel from across the world to stare into its molten heart. I wanted to see that. I wanted to stand somewhere that burned and still called itself alive. The next morning, I took a bus inland toward Haleakala. The road twisted like memory, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel. The higher we went, the more the air thinned, until the lush greens below gave way to barren red stone. When we reached the summit, I stepped out into silence so vast it made my ears ache. The crater stretched before me, immense, ancient, raw. Steam rose in thin curls, the earth breathing in slow fury. A guide spoke softly about how the volcano was considered dormant, but I could feel its pulse through the soles of my shoes. I walked to the edge, alone, and looked down. It felt like looking into every choice I had ever postponed, every word I had bitten back, every time I had folded myself smaller for someone else's comfort. I sat on a rock, the wind tearing at my hair, and pulled out the letter. The paper fluttered like a living thing. I read it one last time, not as a plea, but as a mirror. Each sentence reflected the same fear, the fear of a son who could not love a mother unless she stayed soft, familiar, obedient to his idea of love. I whispered into the wind, "I release you." Then I tore the letter in half, and then in half again and again, until the words were confetti. I opened my hand, and the pieces lifted, carried by the updraft, scattering into the crater like a quiet snowfall. I didn't cry. The air was too thin for tears. It demanded breath instead. I stood there until the wind calmed, until the silence filled every hollow part of me. Then I whispered, not to Adam, not to Derek, but to the version of myself that had waited 78 years for permission. "You are free." On the way down, the bus stopped at a lookout where the clouds lay below the road, soft and immense. The tourists snapped pictures. I didn't. I simply stood there, my coat wrapped around me, and watched the sunlight pour across the sky. When we returned to the coast, it was late afternoon. I walked back to the cafe, though my shift had ended hours before. Heather was sitting outside smoking. She waved. "You look like you've seen God," she said. I smiled. "Something like that." She offered me a cigarette. I took one, though I hadn't smoked in decades. We sat in silence, the kind that needs no translation. When she finished hers, she said, "I'm closing up early. You should come tomorrow morning. I'm putting you in charge of the early shift." I laughed. "You trust me that much?" She grinned. "You're the only one who doesn't need instructions." That night, I walked down to the beach again. The storm from earlier had passed, leaving the air charged and clean. The sand was damp, cool against my feet. The moon, half hidden by clouds, cast everything in silver. I carried a small wooden box I'd bought from a market, a souvenir box carved with plumeria flowers. Inside were small relics of my journey. The shell from my first morning, the photo of Derek, the pendant Rosa had tied around my neck, and a few coins from the cafe's tip jar. I walked to the water's edge and knelt. The waves came and retreated, touching my knees, pulling at the hem of my dress. I opened the box, took out the photograph, and looked at it for a long moment. Derek's smile was still young, unafraid, unknowing of how time erodes certainty. "You'd like it here," I said aloud. "You'd tell me not to make a fuss, to let the kids live their lives. But you'd understand, wouldn't you? That sometimes we have to start over when everyone thinks we're finished." I placed the photo back inside, closed the box, and set it in the shallow water. For a moment it floated, spinning gently. Then the next wave took it. I watched it drift away until it became part of the darkness. The release was not dramatic. It was quiet, almost tender. I stood there until I couldn't see it anymore, until the water erased my footprints. When I finally turned to go, I felt lighter. Not the weightless kind of youth, but the earned lightness of someone who has carried everything long enough. The next morning, I woke before sunrise again, as I always did. But something was different. The island was still holding its breath. I made coffee and sat on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket. The horizon glowed faintly, a new day gathering itself. I thought about calling Adam, about telling him I was all right, but decided against it. He needed silence more than reassurance. Sometimes silence is the only language love can understand. Later that day, I went back to the cafe, put on my apron, and started the morning routine. Grind the beans, wipe the counters, unlock the door. When the first customers arrived, I smiled easily. Rosa came by mid-morning with her grandson, who ran up to hug me. "You smell like coffee," he said, wrinkling his nose. I told him that was the scent of hard work, and he laughed. Rosa watched me for a while, then said softly, "You've changed your eyes. They used to look backward. Now they look wide open." I told her I'd finally remembered something important, that waiting for respect is a slow way to disappear. She nodded, understanding without needing details. That afternoon, after the last customer left, I sat alone at a corner table. The sun poured through the window, turning the air golden. On the counter was a small vase of white orchids Heather had brought that morning. I stared at them and realized that I was no longer living on borrowed space. Every breath here belonged to me. I took out a piece of paper and began to write, not to Adam, not to anyone, but to myself. I wrote about the volcano, about the letter, about the box that now belonged to the ocean. I wrote that I had lived through invisibility and found a kind of brilliance in it. I wrote that love without freedom is just caretaking, and I was done being anyone's keeper. When I finished, I folded the paper and placed it in the drawer beside the postcard that read, "She finally went where she wasn't invited." I smiled, because it was no longer just a clever phrase. It was my entire truth. The waves outside sounded steady and forgiving, and I realized that the climax of my life wasn't something I had done to someone else or something they had done to me. It was this quiet moment of sitting in sunlight, unafraid of my own company, content with the weight and shape of my choices. The world hadn't changed, but I had. I had stepped out of the frame my family built for me and discovered that the view was larger, wilder, infinitely more alive. That evening, I walked once more to the shore. The tide was low, and children were playing where the water met the sand. I stood among them, watching the sun bleed into the horizon. One of the children handed me a small shell, pink and smooth. "For you," she said. I took it, smiling. "Thank you," I whispered. I held it tightly in my palm, feeling its coolness, and then, without thinking, I slipped it into my pocket. Not everything needed to be released. Some things were meant to be carried forward, quiet reminders of the woman who refused to stay home. The sea has begun to sound different to me. It no longer calls or warns. It simply exists, a presence steady and unconcerned, like an old friend who doesn't require conversation to stay close. Every morning, I still wake before the sun, open the balcony door, and let the air fill the room with that faint, briny perfume. The hotel clerk downstairs now greets me with a wave instead of a polite nod. Rosa's grandson sometimes waits for me outside the cafe after school, carrying stories about turtles and the way the waves foam when the wind gets strong. I listen to him, not because I need company, but because his voice folds so easily into the rhythm of this place. My life has become small in scale, but vast in quietness. And I have grown to love that contradiction. I once believed that purpose meant being essential to others, but now I understand that sometimes it means being fully alive, even when no one is watching. A month passed before Adam called. I saw his name flash on the screen, and my first instinct was to let it fade to voicemail, but something inside me said, "No, answer this one." His voice was softer than I remembered, the edges worn down by reflection. "Mom," he said, "I just wanted to hear you." There was a pause, a long exhale that sounded like surrender. I told him I was well, that the cafe kept me busy, that the island had a way of stretching time until even regret grew lazy. He laughed quietly, and in that sound, I heard the boy who used to run barefoot through our yard. He told me the kids still talk about seeing me at the festival, and that Lisa had printed a photo of us together, the only one we took that day. "You look happy," he said. "Freer." I told him I was, and that freedom doesn't cancel love, it just gives it more room to breathe. We didn't talk long. Before hanging up, he said, "I'm glad you found something that feels like yours." I said, "I always had it. I just stopped giving it away." After the call, I sat on the balcony for a long while, the phone warm in my hand. The sunset was generous that evening, a riot of colors pouring across the horizon, as if the world had decided to confess all its beauty at once. I thought of Derek then, not with grief, but with gratitude. He had loved me in his way, steady, limited, human, and I had spent years carrying the pieces of that love like relics. Now, for the first time, I could see them as they were, fragments of a full story, not the whole book. I whispered his name into the wind, not as a plea, but as a thank you for having existed with me at all. The next morning, I walked to the pier and watched the fishermen haul in their nets. One of them, a young man with a kind face, offered me a small fish, laughing when I protested that I didn't know what to do with it. "You'll learn," he said, "or you'll feed the cat." I took it home and actually cooked it, clumsily but successfully, the smell filling the room like a proof of life. It tasted of salt and patience. While I ate, I wrote another postcard, not to myself this time, but to no one in particular. If they tell you to stay home, pack light and go anyway. You don't owe anyone your stillness. I didn't sign it. I left it on the cafe counter the next day for someone to find, a small message floating out into the world like a bottle tossed to sea. The rainy season came quietly. The afternoons grew humid and slow, and the air thickened with the smell of wet hibiscus. Tourists thinned, leaving the island to its residents, and the few of us who had learned to move at its pace. On those long, drowsy days, I began sketching again. Simple lines at first, the curve of the shoreline, the tilt of a palm. I hadn't drawn since before Adam was born. My hand remembered, though, and soon the pages of my notebook filled with drawings of people I'd met. Rosa laughing, Heather wiping her hands on her apron, Arthur reading his newspaper by the window. Faces that might never matter to the world, but mattered deeply to me. Sometimes I think we only begin to see others clearly when we stop needing them to mirror us. One evening, the power went out across town. The cafe closed early, and I walked home under a sky bright with stars, the kind of stars I hadn't seen since I was a girl. Without the hum of machines, the world sounded immense. I stood in the middle of the road, head tilted back, and felt the strange ache of being both tiny and infinite. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, My son was probably watching television, my grandchildren doing homework, Lisa setting the table. Their lives continued without me, as mine did without them, and yet none of it felt like loss. We were all just pieces of the same story, drifting through our chapters, meeting briefly on the same pages before turning again. A few days later, Rosa brought me a small gift, a bracelet made of black volcanic stone. "For strength," she said, "though I think you already have plenty." I slipped it onto my wrist, feeling the smoothness of each bead, and realized how much I'd changed since arriving. My reflection in the mirror startled me sometimes, not because I looked older, but because I finally looked present. The lines on my face had stopped being signs of decline. They had become geography, proof of where I'd been. I didn't hide them anymore. Sometimes tourists still wander into the cafe and tell me I remind them of someone, their mother, their aunt, a teacher who once changed their life. I smile, pour their coffee, and let them think whatever they need to. They don't know that I've become all of those women, and none of them at once. When they leave, I wipe the table and think about how, for most of my life, I believed my value depended on who was looking. Now, even when no one looks, I am still here, breathing, working, laughing at my own small jokes. It is a simple miracle, this ordinary persistence. Every now and then, when the air is still and the waves seem to hold their breath, I imagine another woman somewhere, maybe sitting in a kitchen that smells of tea and quiet disappointment, hearing her child say the same words. "Mine," once said. "You can stay home, Mom." I imagine her smile, the practiced one, the ache she hides behind it. And I want to reach across the years and the distance and tell her this: you are allowed to leave. You are allowed to want more than gratitude and survival. The world doesn't end when you step outside the circle they built for you. It begins. I want her to know that the first step is the hardest, only because it breaks the silence that others have mistaken for peace. Tonight, the moon is high again, silvering the water until it looks like glass. I sit by the window, the sound of the tide rising and falling like breath. The shell the little girl gave me rests on the table beside the lamp, its pink curve catching the light. I keep it there not as a relic, but as a compass. It reminds me that even the smallest thing can survive the pull of the sea and wash ashore whole enough to begin again. I will sleep soon, and tomorrow I will wake early as always, make coffee, unlock the cafe door, and start another day that belongs entirely to me. I don't need to write another postcard. I've already sent my message, in every step I take, in every decision to stay present, in every refusal to shrink. The story has no grand ending, because life doesn't. It just continues, softer, wiser, filled with the quiet certainty that I am exactly where I chose to be.